Environmentalists say governments are moving slowly or too slowly to mitigate climate change. They are now heading to the courts to take action against companies not meeting emission targets. In South Africa, for instance, 9 climate change related cases have been brought before the courts. Let's find out more now from Alecia Pienaar from law firm Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr. Thank you so much, Alecia, for your time here on eNCA. Just tell us in terms of the emission transgressions that these companies are being taken to court for.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me today. So in South Africa specifically, we actually haven't seen a lot of litigation directly against these companies. It's more in foreign jurisdictions. In South Africa, the focus has mainly been acting against government in climate change related cases, taking them to court and saying that not enough is being done in terms of our road to net zero. And usually it relates to, there's a link to climate change, but the cause of action is really in and of itself. So if we talk about one of the most recent ones, it would be where it's a youth-led climate change litigation case where they are instituting action against the Minister of Environmental Affairs and Electricity for the procurement of new generation from coal-fired power plants. So again, it is not necessarily against the private sector in South Africa as yet. However, international precedent is making it clear that the risk is definitely increasing.
So what is the difference then? Is it because in the international world, government is imposing, but companies are not following, whereas in South Africa, our government has not started being strict enough?
So I think generally you'll see internationally it's not exempt from it. There's also multiple cases against the government as well. So it is just about the fact that they're generally more advanced in terms of the litigation processes and taking these entities to court. I think in South Africa, due to the fact that the Paris Agreement and the national determined contribution made in terms of that has been made and committed to by government, you'll generally find the actions being taken against government. But again, no one is immune at this stage. And what has been proven in the international arena is the fact that there's this duty of care that the public sees that rests on the private sector due to the fact that essentially stems from the Paris Agreement and that they also have to take action. So again, it really is something that hasn't happened here yet, but we can see it slowly becoming an increasing risk, just taking into account what is happening overseas.
So I guess a warning to South African businesses that it could be a phenomenon that starts happening here as well.
Exactly. And yeah, again, there have been some companies, but again, it's not climate change in and of itself. The cause of action, there might be a link to it. But the climate change in and of itself is not the main cause of action.
Is there is there some type of increase in terms of South African companies or companies that are operating in South Africa?
Sorry, is there an increase in risk for them?
In risk, yes.
Oh, yes, definitely. Due to the fact that we obviously have made these commitments, as I said, that they have essentially translated into a duty of care in relation to some of these companies, the risk is definitely increasing. And in and over above that, you've got a very carbon intensive industries, a number of them in South Africa. And for that reason, they need to consider that they have specific obligations that will also be stemming from our nationally determined contribution, in that the government cannot ultimately reach those goals unless it is the private sector entities that also come to the party.
And I understand there's also a litigation report into climate change and the promises that were made in Paris that is showing an increased concern on us and the rest of the world, not just South Africa, actually not meeting those targets.
Yes, so you've also seen recently, the report indicates that it's really one of the issues that is fueling this litigation. And I think very recently, this past week, you've seen the European Council put forward its negotiation position in relation to COP28, clearly indicating that the national determined contributions of various countries are not sufficient in order to combat climate change and keep our global increase in temperature below that threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So yes, unfortunately, not enough is essentially being done based on what we've been seeing.
So with what you've seen, especially internationally with the companies, the 9 companies that have been taken to court for litigation, etc., what would be your advice to companies right now in terms of contributing at least to what the whole world promised in Paris?
I think one of the important things just for companies is to actually take it seriously. I know that there's generally sometimes not necessarily a proactive approach in really understanding what the extent of your footprint is. Sometimes entities will believe that their impact on climate change is not as significant because, for example, they're not emitting a significant amount of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions. However, they might be intensive electricity users, and ultimately that electricity is being generated by coal-fired power stations, or they might have a big reliance on water. So it really is about the fact that you need to take it seriously, and once you do so, you become proactive. It's about really understanding the impact of your full value chain. And once you do that, I think it's only then that you understand what your responsibilities are, both from a policy and from a legal and really a human rights perspective in terms of the steps you need to take to ensure that you ultimately manage your impact.
All right, there's some advice for you if you have a company running here in South Africa from Alecia about what you can do to avoid being one of those companies that will one day probably be taken to court and litigated against. Alecia Pienaar is a senior associate at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr Attorneys.